webinar as well, but particularly to Neil for chairing and to colleagues who are presenting tonight. I think a lot of the value will be in the discussion that we have, and so I'm not going to speak for long, and the presenters will be limited to time to make sure that we do get that valuable discussion. I'm very conscious of the industry concerns around Bluetongue 3, given that it started off in Europe but moved into southeast England last year and has continued to spread. And I think we should recognise the impact that this has had on bits of England, and the fact that the controls that have been put in place there have helped to protect us from disease. Going forwards, there are concerns that as we get into the seasonal vector period, then Bluetongue will continue to spread and may get into high livestock density areas, which will present further challenges, not least around the impact on livestock. As yet, it doesn't seem to have been particularly significant across the whole. Some people have been badly affected, but once it's in dense areas, it may be worse. But there's also the concern about testing for Bluetongue and the effect that that may have on APHA and the lab. Collectively, my understanding to date is that we in Scotland would prefer to continue to keep it out rather than to accept that the disease may well become endemic. And I'm keen to hear people's thoughts on that as we go through. We still don't have a fully approved vaccination for Bluetongue. When we do, that may change things. Industry are working hard towards vaccination, and we're continuing to review our thoughts on it because there are positives and negatives. We're really keen to hear what you think, your thoughts, your concerns, your suggestions, and we'll try and keep you informed of what we're doing. I hope that this webinar is useful in achieving that. But I would say the situation is fluid, and it's likely to remain fluid because the risk to Scotland will change depending where disease is in England, and indeed if it jumps. So I think we need to bear in mind that while we will talk today about the current situation and what we think will be the situation going forwards, it may change and we may need to speak to you again. But with that, I'm going to hand back to Neil and open up the presentations first and then the discussion.
Thank you, Sheila, very much. Right, we'll quickly move on now to Richard Hepple. Richard's going to give us an update on some of the epidemiology and also a Schmallenberg update. Richard is a veterinary epidemiologist working with APHA in the field. He's got a lot of experience from the previous Bluetongue outbreak 2007-2008, and also field work during foot and mouth disease in 2001. Richard, floor is yours.
Thanks, Neil. So it'd be my colleague Helen cover the Schmallenberg update. I'll just stick with the Bluetongue. The high-level figures since the first case was detected in the last season at the end of August 2024. There'd been reports of suspect disease from 565 different premises. Of those, 259 have been confirmed with one or more positive animals. That includes 2 premises in Wales and a holding in Kent that had Bluetongue 3, as well as a single animal with Bluetongue 12. There is a case map on the gov.uk site that people can look at. They can see where the cases are, and they can superimpose cattle and sheep densities on those. Within that total of 565 reports, 304 have been negated, and as of yesterday, there were 2 pending. There have been 16 detections outside of the expanded restricted zone. Those have been linked to movements out of the restricted zone before before the zone was in place or from areas before they got caught up in the zone. On those cases, we have done further investigation and sampling to make sure that there hasn't been any onward spread, and that has not been demonstrated. In terms of surveillance and tracings, we've done a lot of work. There's 29,500 animals have been sampled. Those have predominantly been cattle because that's where we're focusing most of our surveillance. So about 23,700 cattle, of which 238 positive animals were found. 5,700 odd sheep, of which we found 12 positive animals, and those were from tracings. And we haven't found anything in a smaller number of goats and camelids. We've also, an additional strand of surveillance has been the end of season or winter surveillance that we've been running for several years now. That's looking for any other detections. We run those typically in the high-risk counties down the east and southern areas of the country. This year that was extended to include Dorset, Devon and Cornwall, Hampshire, the Isle of Wight, West Sussex, East Sussex and Kent. We've also been seeing an increasing number of fertility issues, which Neil will, I think, will be commenting on shortly, including dummy calves being born to positive dams and other fertility issues and reports of non-viable calves. We're in the process of undertaking an impact study on certain farms that have experienced bluetongue, looking at a variety of different factors and the impacts on them, including clinical signs, the most common ones, and the severity of those. That will be all be published in due course, but it is an ongoing part of the study. And I think that will do for me for now. Thanks, Neil. I obviously can pick up anything else in the questions.
Great. Richard, thank you very much for that. So we'll move on swiftly to Helen Carty. So Helen's a veterinary investigation officer at SIUC based at the surveillance hub in Ayr, and also carries out diagnostic farm animal postmortems for surveillance at Glasgow Vet School. Helen, please.
Thanks, Neil. I was just asked to give a brief update on Schmallenberg cases in Scotland for obvious reasons, with the similar vectors being involved with bluetongue. So since late December, we've confirmed congenital malformations due to Schmallenberg virus on 29 holdings. To date, there are some suspect cases on the go at the moment, and that's been in 19 flocks and in 10 herds. Diagnoses have predominantly been across the southern half of Scotland, with Perthshire being the furthest north, although homebred animals from other areas of Scotland have shown evidence of exposure to Schmallenberg virus on serology. The vast majority of these diagnoses have been made by PCR testing by colleagues at Morden, or in a small number of cases, typical changes on histology in conjunction with evidence of dam exposure. The sheep cases were submitted between the end of December and early March, and cattle cases from mid-February and are still being submitted now. But the timelines for both of these suggest that the dam exposure to Schmallenberg virus will have been between September and November. Although there have been reports of flocks with a high proportion of affected lambs, in most of the confirmed cases this has not been the case, and only small numbers of animals have been affected. Depending on the pathology seen, there's a flow chart that allows vets testing these cases to exclude bluetongue where it's considered appropriate. We're aware that these cases that we're diagnosing will not be all of them, and that more cases will have occurred in the field without sampling having been done or without sufficient samples taken to make a diagnosis. Nonetheless, it's worth remembering that not all deformed calves and lambs are due to Schmallenberg, even when the presentation appears to be typical. So we've got, other pathogens involved and genetic causes possibly as well. I think I'll leave it at that, Neil, in the interest of time.
Okay, great. Helen, thank you. So for those that might have been a few minutes late in joining, just a recap that all the discussion part, the presentation part of this webinar is being recorded and will be shown at a later date on ScotGov's YouTube channel. We're not going to take questions till the end, and the Q&A session will not be recorded and will not be published at a later date. And I actively ask you to put your questions through the chat function as we go, and we'll come to them at the end. I'm now going to move on some presentations from Scottish Government Disease Control Branch from both Estevao Simoes and Alastair Douglas. Guys, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think, Estevao, you're going to share your slides first, aren't you?
Yep, a second. Can you
Thank you
see
very
this?
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what we've done is we've pulled together an outline of how we might expect movement of susceptible livestock from the restricted zone to Scotland to be managed during a seasonally active period for Bluetongue. And although we technically entered a vector active period at the start of April, given the current temperature data provided for by the Met Office, we've agreed across GB administrations today that the midges are unlikely to have completed their intrinsic incubation period, so they're unlikely to become infectious at this stage. Maternal transmission and infection through the use of infectious germinal products are still a risk for the introduction of BTV, but circulation requires the midge vector to be competent in their intrinsic incubation period. So we've agreed to extend the date of the current movement rules from the 23rd of April to the 15th of May. And this assumes that there's no major changes in circumstance before then. And we'll review that again early May to see if there's any scope to extend that a little bit further. But animals that are pregnant, entire males for breeding, or those that are 60 days of age or under at the time of movement must still be pre-movement tested by PCR with negative results before moving during this low vector period. And all animals out of the Bluetongue restricted zone are still required to have an application for a specific licence, and keepers should continue to apply to APHA for a licence in good time. And I think the suggestion at the moment is still 10 days before the movement. So for now, the planned controls that we are thinking about when we move into the vector active season are kind of highlighted in this slide. And I should highlight at this moment is just the proposed ones. So I'll just read through what we've got here. So the movement to live an England restricted zone to Scotland, we will require a pre-movement test within 5 to 7 working days. Then if it's a move to a show or market, that's from an English RZ to the free area, which is Scotland, pre-movement testing and no concessions for low risk areas within the restricted zone. And then we've got moves to shows and markets. So that's Scotland to England, restricted zone, and then returning back to Scotland. Again, post-movement test and isolation upon return until we've got that negative result. And when thinking about moves to slaughter, then we're not going to require any pre-movement testing. Restricted zone moves are only to a designated slaughterhouse, and there'll be a requirement for the animals to be culled within 20. And then there'll be a requirement for the animals in the that come from the restricted zone to be culled within 24 hours and moving after dawn, and must arrive at the slaughterhouse before dusk. But I've said all that is the caveat there is that we've got EPIC doing some analysis for us on cross-border livestock movements for us to understand the implications of these kind of controls and whether there's any consideration that we can give to that analysis and maybe come up with some alternative conditions. And that would have to have the backing of our veterinary advisors and our chief veterinary officer. So we can move on to the next slide, which is a little bit about vaccination conditions and our thinking about licensing for its use in Scotland. So we could consider the use for vaccination within Scotland as a tool. It's within the Chief Veterinary Officer's gift, and we could do that from a fixed date. The trigger might be the restricted zone snap out, or an indication that it's snapping out in a given time, or we detect disease closer to the border. Another point to note is that BTV vaccination will be permitted for those who wish to protect their herd. So in other words, it's a voluntary vaccination programme. The third bullet point there, vaccination doesn't need to remove the requirement to test while Scotland isn't part of the restricted zone. So in other words, we would still be requiring, even if the animal is vaccinated, to require a PCR test. And that's partly because, as we understand it at the moment, that if an animal is vaccinated, it can still potentially be competent in transmitting disease. And then once we've got the full marketing authorization and we know what the guaranteed immunity period is, then I think we can review our controls at that stage. And that's a question, for example, do we just dispense with movement controls altogether and become part of a wider restricted zone and ease all these movement restrictions? And we know that hopefully with the next few months that we should have at least one vaccine manufacturer coming forward with a provisional marketing authorization, maybe more. We have some concerns around the availability of vaccines. So, I mean, should we ensure that focuses in the areas where we've got disease previously detected and ensure that we've got that kind of protective cover. And lastly, on vaccination, Scott ID are working with us to develop a vaccination tool so that if you are vaccinating, and we do allow vaccination, then you should be able to go into your movement records on Scott EID and provide some information about what it is that you've vaccinated. So that's it from my side. I'll hand over to Estevao now for the last few slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Alastair. And to add on the vaccination, we've pulled together a sort of a memoir with pros and cons of vaccinating, because with the current vaccines, it's very much an individual farmer decision if it becomes allowed in Scotland, and that can be shared after this. So just moving on. Just to show you the disease spread last season, this is the slide, sorry, the map that Richard was talking about a little bit earlier. When you look at the map, you might have a sense that there will be an amount of unreported disease because of how Bluetongue behaves, and not all animals with signs not animals with disease will show signs, and therefore there's the numbers that we have are quite possibly an underestimation. And I say this because along with the chances of overwintering, you see all these focus of these locations where infection might have reached, and whether or not it will start from those locations as the midges become competent again in transmitting the virus. So it's unknown at the moment whether and how fast disease may spread across England and close to Scotland. Means of overwintering could be in calves of infected mothers. It is theoretically possible that some midges might survive winter in stables, in microclimates, and through semen that has been frozen, for example. But I wanted to highlight the value of pre-movement testing. The reason why the restricted zones exist is to really to follow the spread of the midges where control. So movements outside of restricted zones prevent long distance seeding events. And to give you a sense of the value of pre-movement testing, over last season, approximately 1% of pre-movement tested animals were giving a positive result. Now, this is completely dependent on where the animals came from and whether they were infected in the first place. But considering that there's thousands of moves, long distance seeding is almost a certainty once the pre-movement testing disappears. So this is the risk that we're up against when considering that an RZ might expand, snap out. So if that were to happen, we would be keeping a close eye on whether the disease would reach here. So we've had some plans to do some strip surveillance along the border, and that would involve farms selected at random, which would be contacted, approximately 50 cattle farms, because cattle are more likely to attract midges, and that and do this as 1 round or 2 rounds. If BTV3 was found in Scotland, I think we still have 2 options. If it's a single long distance incursion and we are confident it's not already in the midges, then we would slaughter the infected animal with compensation for the farmer to contain the risk of that infected animal passing it to local midges and then establishing us in the new area. If that ship has sailed, then it would then make sense that an RZ follows the cloud of midges. Well, there remains a question whether it's a whole part of Scotland, and that would take into consideration many other factors, such as what the trading patterns are and where in Scotland was this disease detected. One final comment on testing laboratory capacity. Capacity is limited, so people will be advised to book early, and the result, sorry, in the application will have to be managed through the HA licensing team because it is a commodity, and official surveillance could take priority, for example, if it was needed. We are trying to increase lab capacity, but this might take longer than it's ideal for the current season. But, I'll stop here, I think. Thank you.
Okay, guys, thank you. So I just encourage people to start thinking about questions and getting ready to put questions in the chat. So we're going to move on now to a session on trade impacts from Neil Wilson. Neil had a distinguished career in banking before setting up his own consultancy business, and as part of that, he looks after the interests of the Institute of Auctioneers and Appraisers in Scotland. So Neil, over to you.
Great, well, thanks, Neil. Just before I start, I'd just like to say a quick thanks to Harry Orty and Sibyl Moore from EPIC for the work they've been doing on the cross-border livestock movements. And I think, as Alastair said there, that work's still ongoing. So I suppose my version here will be a summary of that around about the trade. And just what we heard there from Alastair and from Estevao sort of gives you a real flavour about some of the challenges we're going to have with trade cross-border. And it's like, it goes without saying, it's critical to support disease control and prevention, but we just can't ignore the fact that any of these sort of movement restrictions being placed on animals coming into Scotland will significantly impact and distort trade, as well as having the potential to create longer-term headaches for farmers' breeding policies, their marketing of livestock, and as well as impacting those who ensure a vibrant trading environment, such as the auction marts and hauliers, and probably especially in the south of Scotland and the north of England, but it's definitely not going to be restricted to those areas. In terms of cross-border livestock flow, it's certainly dominated by movements from Scotland into England, and as far as I can tell, currently there's no proposal to restrict this flow. And these moves are likely to be able to continue as they are now, unless something else changes. However, there is a vibrant cross-border trade of sheep and cattle that flows into Scotland. And as part of that, there's a very strong trading environment in the border marts with high numbers of Scottish cattle and sheep being sold through Rings and Longtown, Carlisle, Wooler, and other markets in the north of England. That trade's both for slaughter and to live. And in 2024, from what we can see so far, around about 46 to 47,000 cattle and 213 to 214,000 sheep were moved into Scotland from England. And during that year, around about 16,000 cattle and 104,000 sheep were moved into Scotland to live via marts located in England. And those marts account for around about 50% of live cattle moves and 90% of live sheep moves. Looking at the live cattle moves, we are, and this is a broad estimate here, but we're estimating that around 7% of those moves are for pedigree or breeding, so generally breeding but including pedigree. Around about 30% are calves, 48% store cattle, and that leaves around about 15% as dairy cattle moves. Of the 104,000 sheep, we're estimating that around 20% are for breeding, including pedigree. 35% are store lambs, which we believe the remainder is probably made up of prime sheep and cull ewe transactions. The broad valuation of this livestock moving cross-border to live is therefore, certainly north of 50 million, probably between 50 and 60 million pounds from what we can see at the moment. Again, I would just say that comes with a health warning. We're still trying to pin down exactly what these numbers and figures look like, so that number could change, but it's just to give an indication of the economic value that's there. Look, it's going to be crucial for farmers, markets, hauliers to consider how these restrictions could impact their business now and into the future. We heard a little bit there about the testing. I think initially some of the costs that I've heard for testing is likely to mean that most sheep movements are likely to be economically unviable. And with that in mind, with around 20% of all sheep moves being for breeding, this could have a significant impact on breeding sales and farmer decision making on their breeding purchases. If these restrictions are still in place later in the year, large tuck sales such as Kelso could also be impacted should the restrictions still be in place at that time. And again, that is just a big unknown. I think one of the other significant issues is the dairy cattle movement restrictions into southwest Scotland. Could also see Scottish dairy businesses being impacted, albeit, I think we can acknowledge that testing for cattle could be more economically viable. Obviously, I talked about roughly half the moves are storing young cattle coming into Scotland. As expected, the majority of these would end up with finishers and onwards to processors. The loss of that cattle could have quite a negative impact on those finishers and processors, which are, I think we know sectors already seeing numbers tighten due to reduced cattle numbers in Scotland. And as I highlighted, store lamb numbers into Scotland could also be curtailed. Excuse me. Institute of Auctioneers members are acutely aware of the impact that these movement restrictions will have on everyone working in the livestock industry, from farm through the supply chain. And the impacts will be significant, both financially and in terms of breeding and replacement policies. So, I believe that we need to try to find a balance between disease prevention and control and the negative economic and breeding impacts that these restrictions could bring, both to industry, but this is also going to certainly be magnified in some individual businesses. Not just marts, but there'll certainly be farm businesses and haulage businesses and others that will be impacted by this. As I say, probably more likely in the south of Scotland, but it's not going to be restricted to that area. And Neil, with that, I think we'll just draw to a close there. And then I think we can look forward to questions and comments from the audience around about that. And I think we'd welcome some broad views around about the trade element of that from all the other participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, very much for that. A little note, as chair, questions can be put in the chat. I would prefer if we don't answer them till the end so that everyone can get the opportunity to hear and see in case somebody misses it. We'll now move on to a few presentations from industry direct people. We're going to start with Hugh Fraser. Hugh's chair of the NFUS Livestock Committee, farms up in the Highlands of Scotland with 160 suckler cows and some sheep, and is also a director at Dingwall Market. So Hugh, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Just moving on from what Neil said earlier on one of our big concerns would be anything that causes trade distortions. I wasn't aware of the high number of stock movements both ways back and forth across the border. At our last livestock committee meeting, we took the view that, yeah, as Sheila said earlier on, we would like to keep disease out of Scotland, but we fully recognise that this is a fluid situation. And, we're going to have to move with whatever happens in front of us. I suppose costs have been raised from our side of the industry, testing costs, vaccine availability. Some of the early lambing pedigree flocks are very, very concerned that, you know, if they were going to use a vaccine, they would be looking to use a vaccine in the next month, 6 weeks, to suit, you know, early tipping. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that Scotty ID are working on a method of recording vaccination use, because I understand that will be quite important going forward, as you know there's no marker in the vaccines. The milk committee guys met earlier on this year too. They were definitely more in favour of vaccination than we were. It's all almost, it's not irrelevant in my part of the world, but I think its relevance becomes less important, and it's going to be extremely difficult for us as an organisation to actually come up with a representative view for the whole of the country. And you know, we're maybe going to have to look at splitting the country into different zones. Yeah, not much else really from this side of the fence. I suppose that's really it. Trade distortion would be the big thing for us, and probably the lack of information as to the efficacy of the vaccines on fertility. Is it actually worth using them? How long are they going to last? You know, are we looking at maybe vaccinating twice in a season? Some guys had said earlier on that, you know, if they were going to use it in cattle, they'd be on sucklers, they'd be looking to do that at turnout. That's obviously not going to happen, because we're not that far down the line. So just, I suppose it really shows how fluid a situation this is. Yeah, thank you, Neil. I think that's about all from this side.
Okay, Hugh, thank you very much. We're moving through this very smoothly, so we're going to have lots of time for questions at the end. We're now going to move on to Gareth Hepple from the BVA. Gareth's been a vet for over 40 years, lead of the APHA Cattle Expert Group, current president of the British Veterinary Association Scottish branch, sits on the GB Livestock Core Group for Bluetongue, and a past president of the British Cattle Veterinary Association and currently a board member. Gareth, please.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Firstly, I hope you can hear me okay. We've had a flaky Wi-Fi at home. I think the first thing to say about Bluetongue is that, to state the bleeding obvious, that for colleagues on the call, it's imperative that if disease is suspected, it must be reported. So I think that's the first thing I wanted to say. So if anybody suspects anything that looks like Bluetongue, and Helen's already outlined the overlap with Schmallenberg, so it's important that diseases are reported to after ASAP. I think the veterinary view, which is based primarily on animal health and welfare, is that that vaccination will ultimately be a major tool in the control of this disease. Where we are at the moment is that the restriction zone in England appears to have been extremely effective, but bear in mind that holds less than 20% of the animal population, the susceptible animal population in England, and as we've already heard, that spread west and north, considerably more animals could be affected, and that could have the impact of having a more serious impact on animals, because the levels of virus will likely increase. So I think that from the veterinary perspective, the bottom line is that vaccination is going to be one of the major tools in the toolbox. And I think from that perspective, I think it's important that colleagues north of the Scottish border make themselves familiar with the current situation. There's a lot of information available on Ruminant Health and Welfare website on gov.uk. Make sure that you're familiar with the legislation, with the vaccine availability information, the details on the the cost calculator and the risk, because there's going to be some fairly quick decision making needed to be done should disease spread. Our view would be it's more likely when rather than if, and so I think that it's important that that farmers and their vets have that conversation as soon as possible. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Right, Gareth. Thanks very much for that. Now, moving swiftly on to Janette Mathie from she's Secretary of the Scottish Dairy Cattle Association. Janette, I'm just checking you're here. I had a quick look through the attendees and didn't see you a minute ago.
I am here, Neil.
Yeah, that's great. So the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for allowing me the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Scottish dairy industry. And the main concerns within the Scottish dairy industry are the welfare issues caused by the virus to cattle, and also the economic issues caused to farm businesses. As we all know, that the virus makes cows unwell, lethargic, etc., subsequently reducing milk yields, which may be up to 8% on some farms. It also affects the fertility of animals. It costs approximately £5 for every day a cow does not get back in calve. Bluetongue virus also causes abortions, and calves that are born from infected dams may be small, weak, deformed, or blind, or die within days of birth. These are all incur increased vet costs and lost income. As Neil has alluded earlier on, the herds in the border areas and Dumfries and Galloway are especially concerned, as this is the area where over 50% of Scottish dairy cattle are housed, with some having land on both sides of the border, which is a concern to them, because if England decide to do one thing and Scotland decide to do another, where do they stand on that? If Scotland stays as an unrestricted zone, but the whole of England becomes a restricted zone, there will be disruptions due to animal movement and trade restrictions. A lot of dairy cattle from Scotland are sold at Borderway Martin in Carlisle, and it will have a huge effect on both businesses. Pre and post movement tests will be required if animals go into England and Wales, and this will affect shows and events. If Scotland agrees to vaccination using any of the 3 unlicensed vaccines, it will limit the symptoms, thus improve the welfare of the animals, but it will not kill the virus. The vaccine is not effective immediately and requires 2 doses. Will there be enough supply? Block calving herds have a short window to vaccinate before cows get back into calve. Farmers may incur costs from reduced market access, including export markets. This has already affected the trade with Northern Ireland. There are also concerns that new strains such as Bluetongue Virus 12 are appearing in animals in England. Does that mean that we're going to need different vaccines to counteract that? While Scottish dairy farmers appreciate that if Scotland does use vaccination as part of BTV controls, then Scotland would no longer be classed as being BTV free. However, BTV needs to be managed to suit the business's needs of each Scottish dairy farmer, although it would be much preferred that measures were taken to keep the virus out of Scotland for as long as possible. That's really the views from the dairy farmers within Scotland. Thank you.
Janette, thank you very much. It's now my slot. So as part of some work the MBA did earlier this year, we got involved with a concerned suckler producer in Suffolk. And I'm going to go through his calving statistics. And this was the first stage of really us as an organisation, and that information going back through other sources, perhaps to government, that the real problems that this strain of bluetongue can cause. I'm going to do two sort of brief overviews of farm case studies. One farm in Suffolk, 97 cows, generally starts calving early January. Scanning end of October, 19 cows empty. Subsequently after that, another 4 cows empty. So basically 25% empty cows in total. Many early abortions, several dead calves, and then a multitude of non-viable calves. So at the end of calving, this farm in Suffolk, which was not touched by bluetongue last year when many farms round about it maybe was, has got 48 live animals out of 97 calves put to the bull. And that for me is quite concerning at the impacts of this disease. And this said farmer would have been scared, let's say, to use the vaccine, because previous experience from 2007-8 would suggest that the vaccine was maybe a preliminary cause of some of the fertility issues. I think what we've seen in the eastern counties this calving season to date, and spreading further west, is that it's the disease that creates calving issues and fertility problems, certainly not the vaccine. And we are promoting actively, amongst others, to use vaccine as much as possible. Another case in Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and quite away from the coast. 80 cows, 80 cow herd, 22% empty, then 6% aborted, then 6% dead calves, and then 6% non-viable calves. These calves have got neurological problems, half brains or no brains, participate, some of them, in stargazing. They just stand and hold their head right back and look at the sky. And they are, ultimately, they need to be humanely destroyed. They are non-viable. So there's been quite a few of this coming up now. I think there are, APHA have got perhaps 16 cases from 14 different farms. It's been already mentioned tonight that we feel this disease is, grossly underreported. So there could be more of this, and that would be our concern on an industry that is already seriously challenged on numbers. That if this disease spreads openly into heavier areas that are heavier populated with stock with a higher density, then the impacts into next year could be far, far worse. Initially, we thought this was just perhaps in the eastern edge, where potentially the disease dose could have been heavier coming in from the continent, but we've now seen problems with neurological issues in calves to the west of London. So it has travelled a fair bit already. So that's what we've seen as an organisation and our concerns. Although we also understand that the ability to trade means that things can't, arguably be restricted forever. And then, as I say, vaccination. Anyone that is any reservations about using vaccine, I would say just don't. If you can get the vaccine, use it. Protect your breeding females. Another quick point from the Suffolk area, Suckler Farm, 3 groups of cows, 2 groups separated by a fence, nothing more than a fence. Scanning rate of one group was in the 90%. Scanning rate on the group in the field next door was 30%. So 70% empty. So the impact of fertility on bulls, that would have been a case of a bull presumably bitten by a midge. So that's also a concern for the coming breeding season. So that's all I've got to say. We're now going to move on to Phil Stocker. Phil is CEO of the National Sheep Association. He's been 15 years working in agricultural policy and developing organic farming with his background before NSA. He chairs a number of forums, but probably most prominently, he was lately appointed by the government to be the independent chair of Dartmoor Land User Management Group. So, Phil, stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Neil, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part this evening as well. Really important that these dialogues and this communication takes place, so thank you very much. I'm just going to give a few reflections on what we've seen within the sheep industry through this outbreak of BTV3, and I think it's worth just reflecting on the fact that the outbreak that we're dealing with now really started at the end of August last year in 2024, but if you go back a previous year, we did have a number of cases that came over through midge incursion, didn't get to the point that the disease, the virus, was circulating here, and we did manage to stamp it out for a while, I guess, until it reappeared again through midge incursion back in late August 2024, and since then it's been circulating, and it's here. You know, it's I wouldn't say it's endemic, but it's here in Britain. At that time, back in 2023 and in August 2024, most of the reports that were coming from the Netherlands and from Germany as well was that this was a serious, this was a virus that was having a serious impact on sheep farms. There were serious levels of mortality that were being reported. There were serious welfare cases that were being discussed as well. And at that time, I guess there were expectations that sheep were going to be affected more here in Britain, probably more so than cattle at that time. We were aware that cattle were part of a transmission route. And I think, Neil, it'd be interesting to see what you think, but at that time there was talk about what we needed to do to encourage the cattle sector to maybe vaccinate to protect the sheep sector. Things have changed a little bit now. In early autumn last year, the cases were mainly in sheep when this started at the end of August and September. Most of the cases we were seeing at that time were sheep, although again, mortality in our flocks here was still low in comparison to what we were expecting, and the symptoms were much milder, I guess, than we were expecting, and that were being reported in the Netherlands. There were one or two exceptions, and there were a number of farms that had relatively high levels of mortality and some fairly bad welfare cases. And in particular, there were a couple of flocks of early lamb or out of season lamb in Dorset, Poll Dorset sheep. And you might argue at that time of the year their immune function is compromised more so than a lot of other sheep that would have been in prime condition and under low levels of stress at that times of the year as well. But it was really interesting. A couple of those flocks of out of season lambing Dorsets, you know, they were affected quite badly, and they did have fairly significant mortality cases as well. Since then, it's also worth reflecting, I guess, that, you know, we haven't been through a full annual cycle. So this is already proving to be quite unpredictable and quite difficult to read. And I'll come on to this again in a moment, but this is one of the reasons why I think we still need to exercise some care and caution. But, you know, since then, all the way during the winter period, I guess, as midge numbers have fallen and been less active, we've been in that seasonal low vector period, we've seen the numbers of sheep affected really drop off. And through all the surveillance work that has been done, the numbers of sheep that have been identified as positive has been relatively low. And there would have been thousands of sheep that would have been pre-movement tested and post-movement tested as well. But the number of positive cases in sheep have been relatively low. We're also getting no reports of any high levels of MTUs, of barren ewes. We're not hearing of any abortions in sheep, and we're not hearing of any abnormalities in birth as well. I mean, we have in that whole area of Schmallenberg that South Scotland has experienced this year. But as far as Bluetongue are concerned, you know, it doesn't seem to be affecting lambing ewes. There were some early cases of low scanning levels that were felt to be maybe part of rams that may have been positive back in Tuppin time, or rams that just were, they were being affected by Bluetongue. So there were some early cases of low scanning levels, but that seemed to die away quite quickly. But there are possible reasons why sheep have been less affected over this winter period, I guess. And as I said earlier, you know, we've not been through a full annual cycle. There is some evidence that exists that suggests that heavy wooled sheep are less likely to be affected, and you know, newly shorn sheep are more susceptible to midge bites, and if that coincides with a time when midge activity is high, that could have a negative impact. So it's something we should just keep an eye on, I guess. And there is still significant concern about this coming summer and next autumn as well. I think it's worth just bearing in mind that the RZs within England have kept BTV. They were intended to keep BTV away from those higher density livestock areas, and they have been effective in doing that as well. It's worked, but I would say that it's caused significant pain to many of those businesses, those farmers within RZs, and they have absorbed some of that pain, taken some of that pain to protect the rest of the industry in other parts of England and the devolved nations as well. I think we need to recognise that. There is a feeling, I think, that we were always going to get to a point where the RZ was going to snap out, potentially to an all England RZ, and that was going to force some discussion and decisions both in Wales and in Scotland about what the policy was going to be there. And I think it's worth recognising that when we were talking about the potential for that RZ to snap out to all of England, that was based on the fact that vaccination was going to be an option. That was probably the main tool in the toolbox for farmers to be able to protect their livestock if we opened up and let this virus go. And there are questions at the moment about the reliability of future vaccine supplies. So I think we need to be really careful about that and remember that it was one of the tools that would allow us to snap out. So I do think that there's still a real need to exercise care and caution in the sheep industry. As I say, we've not seen much impact, but we've not been through a full annual cycle. And I think we should be taking this, treating this with real care, both in terms of reporting, observing any suspected clinical cases and reporting those, but also being really responsible around moves, responsible about testing as well, and responsible about vaccinating stock. Neil and others have talked a lot about trade already, but we know that those RZs in England were affected badly through trade restrictions and movement restrictions, and wherever we set those borders for an RZ, even if it's the whole of England, there will be trade implications, and Neil and others have talked about those, and I won't repeat those any further, I don't think. It's not giving anyone very much clarity, this uncertainty. Here we are on the 15th of April, and we still don't quite know what's going to happen over this next month or so. But I do support the approach of staying flexible, and Sheila used the term, staying fluid. And I think that's absolutely right, and trying to make sure that we make the right decision and do the right thing at the right time. And I would also just finally say that the involvement in all of our UK nations in discussions is still being really, really helpful. The fact that we are coming together in Scotland now, and Wales have done similar things, and we've done that in England, but we do come together regularly, and it's great to see people from all of our devolved nations involved in core group discussions, which is influencing the way we define our policy in a way the way forward. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you very much. And there's never any competition between cattle and sheep, as you know. So, good stuff. Right, so we're now going to move on to Julie Fitzpatrick. Julie, are you here? Right, we'll miss Julie out, and we'll now go to John Fletcher. So John's got a PhD from Cambridge for work on hormonal control of red deer breeding behaviour using wild and tame deer on the Isle of Rum. In 1973, he started the UK's first commercial deer farm, sells red deer for breeding throughout the world. He's won the Queen's Award for Export. He's a partner in Venison Advisory Services Limited, and he has a seat at the Deer Management Round Table. John, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about deer. I don't want to go on very long about this because I'm sure most of you think it's very peripheral to the serious issues affecting cattle and sheep, but there is at least a potential risk that deer could become a wildlife reservoir, and I think it might be helpful if people had the opportunity to find out a little bit of the background of the deer industry as it is. There are really three systems under which deer are kept. Most importantly and numerically is the wild deer sector, which we don't know how many wild deer there are, but there are probably somewhere between 2 and 3 million, and they comprise 6 species. And these species are all extremely different to each other. They're as closely related taxonomically as cows are to sheep. So we would expect that they will respond to bluetongue in different ways. And we already know that the American white-tailed deer, for example, have a different response to bluetongue compared to the European deer. So we've got the 6 species being red, fallow, sika, roe, muntjac, and Chinese water deer in descending order of size. The 3 smallest species are increasing rapidly in numbers and extending their range, especially in the south of England, into peri-urban situations. And we have roe deer extending fast in Scotland into urban situations too. Red deer in Scotland are probably increasing in numbers in woodland and commercial forestry, but stable or falling on the open hill. Nature Scot estimates around 400,000 wild red deer on open hill ground, with a further 100,000 in woodland. About 150,000 roe and red are killed annually in Scotland. They're killed by professional and amateur stalkers and either sold locally or processed through approved game handling establishments. By their very nature, disease in wild deer may go unnoticed, so these stalkers are a critical link if there's any possibility of recognizing disease at an early stage. The stalkers are trained and they are motivated. Wild deer movements are unlikely to be more than perhaps a mile, but red deer during the rut may move up to 10 miles. So that would be the possibilities for transmission of the disease geographically. The second category is park deer, mostly in England, mostly fallow. These are animals kept in enclosures, not normally capable of being handled. And it also, you could argue, includes zoo collections and may include many exotic species. The farm deer sector is the one obviously more closely related to cattle and sheep. We've got about 30,000 deer farm deer now in Britain, of which almost all are red deer. About half of these are in Scotland, so around 15,000 in Scotland. And these animals are transported to Dovecote Park in South Yorkshire for slaughter, almost all of them. So Dovecote Park for Waitrose and Marks and Spencers are killing about 10,500 farmed red deer per annum. They also kill about 2,000 park deer, which are killed under stringent quality assurance, but those are transported as carcasses. The use of these of Dovecote Park to kill farm deer represents by far the largest reason for deer movements. And of course it is to an abattoir, so it's perhaps not very important in the industry in relation to bluetongue. Some farm deer are also being transported as breeding stock, but those movements are few in slaughter and the animals have to be identified. Just a very quick statement about the effects of bluetongue in deer. Wild deer in Europe are known to have seroconverted to BTV3 and may have been viremic, but have shown no clinical signs. In the New World, white-tailed deer and other New World deer species have shown clinical disease and mortality in response to BTV. There is also EHDV, which is often confused with BTV and collectively is known as hemorrhagic disease in North America. And EHDV is probably the major cause of clinical disease in deer in the States and in Canada. It has also, EHDV has caused clinical disease and mortality in European wild deer. And I suppose there is always the possibility that EHDV will come over here, transported by midges. So I just wanted to point this all out and to thank you for the opportunity to discuss deer at all. And to ask everybody to bear in mind that there is at least a theoretical risk that wild deer could provide a wildlife reservoir for bluetongue. Thank you.
John. Thank you very much. A lot of insight in that. Now, at this point, I am going to thank all the speakers for presenting and passing on their knowledge tonight. Louise or Jim, can you confirm to me that the recording has stopped?